Star Trek Academy Collision Course. Chapter 49. Kirk pulled himself up from the deck feeling dizzy. The once bright bridge was darkly shadowed, lit only by emergency battery lights. "Sound off!" Kirk shouted over some mechanical whine. Everyone answered but one. "How's Finnegan?" Kirk called out. "Still unconscious," Spock reported, "but no injuries." A flash of blue light suddenly strobed through the bridge. A few seconds later, it happened again. The view screen had reset itself and now showed flashes of Neptune as the Enterprise whirled over it. Kirk went to the helm, but the controls were unresponsive. "I can't stop the spinning." He looked back at Spock, who had returned to the science station. "Any sign of Griffin?" "Unfortunately, yes." Spock waved his hand over a switch. On the displays above him, views from the Enterprise's other optical sensors took shape. They revealed Griffin's ship clamped around the middle of the Enterprise like a giant set of jaws, and the elongated dome of one nacelle was jammed up against the saucer's main impulse port. If that port fired, the explosion would tear apart both ships. "Well, we stopped him all right," Kirk said, "and he stopped us." He found Z in the gloom, a flashing blue light. "Z, it's time to call Starfleet. It's time to call anyone." But Z was already at the comm station, resetting controls. We've lost all channels. Communications are gone." Kirk blanked, thinking. Each time the blue of Neptune flashed across the bridge, it seemed brighter. He went to Spock. "Our orbit's decaying, isn't it?" "It is," Spock confirmed. "Do our life pods have enough thrust to boost us to higher orbit?" Spock shook his head. "We passed that point 10 minutes ago. Is there anything on the ship that's still working?" Spock passed his hands over the sensors, making screen after screen of technical readout appear on the overhead displays. Then one screen remained, and some of the numbers on it were green. "Transporters," Spock said. "One installation is still online and operational." "Then you know what we have to do, right?" Spock didn't look any happier than Kirk felt. "I do." They left the bridge together. Kirk staggered to the side as soon as he had resolved from the matter stream in the cargo hold of Griffin's ship. Spock had warned him the transport could be rough. Station to station, or even lens-to-lens transport within a single station was one thing, but it was extremely difficult to beam to an open location that was less than half a kilometer away. Kirk essayed a deep breath. Good. He could still breathe. He checked his hands. 5 fingers on each. All of that, plus the fact that he was standing and thinking, convinced him Spock had known what he was doing. Now it was up to him. Spock was certain that the Enterprise's impulse engine could lift both ships into a more stable orbit, but not until the port was clear. Kirk had to get to Griffin's flight deck and figure out some way to move the ship. The other thing Spock was certain about was that they had less than 30 minutes for Kirk to accomplish his mission. By then, Spock said, the first tenuous wisps of Neptune's atmosphere would be thick enough to tear both ships to splinters. Kirk turned slowly in the cargo bay, using a tricorder to build a map of the ship's layout. Knowing Griffin was somewhere on the ship, he would have liked to have brought a weapon, but the Enterprise's armory had been empty. He heard a quiet shuffling sound behind him, but he kept turning in a slow circle. He did, however, carefully adjust the tricorder to scan for life forms, but he didn't need a tricorder for what he found. An 8-year-old boy. He wore coveralls that were too big for him, the sleeves cut down and the legs rolled up with a black equipment belt tightly cinching his waist. The boy's face was pale and hollow-cheeked, and his black hair was flattened to his forehead, long unwashed. A crust of blood was under his nose, and Kirk guessed he'd been hurt in the collision. "Can you help me?" the boy asked Kirk. Kirk felt a wave of fear course through him, but fought it down. This wasn't Tarsus 4. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Borum." "Do you have parents?" The bad guy hurt them. Kirk stared at the child. How could this boy have been on Earth and ended up this way? What bad guy? Griffin. The boy's lips trembled. Do you know where your parents are? The boy snuffled, shook his head, wiped his nose with the back of his hand. Will you help me? He asked again. Kirk crouched down, remembering all the ones he'd failed. I will. Come here. He waved the boy closer and reached for his communicator. Spock could beam the boy back to the Enterprise, and the boy slashed Kirk's side with a flash driver. The acid pain was startling. Kirk toppled over, kicked out instinctively, but the boy laughed and danced around him, waving the sharp-pointed tool over his head. Ha ha! I got the prize, the boy sang. Kirk rolled to meet his next attack, and Borum jumped back. But as soon as Kirk put his hand on the deck to push himself up, the boy darted in and struck again, slicing across Kirk's sleeves and into his arm. Kirk had a sudden image of what would happen if he grabbed his arm and rolled back to the deck. The boy would be there to slit his throat. So he reached to his side, offering himself up for another attack. Borum hooted in delight and ran at him, and Kirk swung his arm back around with a tricorder and caught the boy under the chin, sending him flying. The flash driver skittered across the metal deck. Kirk was by the stunned boy in an instant. He used the child's own equipment belt to tie Borum's arms and hands behind his back. He ripped the shoulder strap off the tricorder and used it to tie his legs. He thought of gagging him, then just as quickly decided not to. The boy's nose was so clogged from crying or dirt there was a chance he'd suffocate. That moment of hesitation was all it took. Borum's eyes cleared, and for a moment panic set in as he realized his arms and legs were immobilized. He shrieked then, the sound more cutting than any alarm on the Enterprise. Kirk knelt by him, thinking quickly. He couldn't put his hand over the boy's mouth because he knew he'd be bitten. He wouldn't hit him again because that had been wrong, and he didn't want to know where that violence had come from. So as the boy thrashed and struggled and tried to break free of his bonds, Kirk grabbed a fistful of Borum's t-shirt and stretched it over his mouth, at least muffling the sound. Too aware of the time limit he faced to save his ship and his friends, Kirk rapidly scanned the cargo bay, trying to find some place he could safely stash the boy. That was when he realized the boy's alarm had been heard. 3 teenagers were in the cargo bay doorway, 2 of them holding laser rifles. The third was Matthew, and all 3 wore red bandanas. Chapter 50. 4 days after the revolution, 4 days after 14-year-old Jimmy had been given his red bandana and his yellow card, all in the same night, he knew it was over. He'd failed the younger ones he was supposed to protect, and he was going to die now. Of the 24 who had been in his cabin, 4 were left. The governor himself gave Donnie, because everyone knew Jimmy Kirk always followed the rules. He'd take Donnie back to the storehouses and then just give himself up because that's what he'd been told to do. Donnie Roy was 4, Billy Clute 7, Edith Zaglata 8, Tay Hebert 9. They'd survived long enough for him to lead them to safety under the arena stands. But now Matthew was coming, and he'd kill them all. 4 days after the revolution, it was over. Approaching footsteps crunched heavily over frosty ground, over rubble, over bodies. "We've got a sensor, Jimmy. We're going to find you." "They know where we are," Tay whimpered. A tall figure jumped down beside them, boots grinding on debris. Edith and Billy both screamed. Tay cried. Donnie hugged Jimmy, shaking silently. "Get up." It was Griffin, from the storehouse table, wearing his parka and the red bandana that said he was on the governor's list. He pointed his laser rifle at Jimmy. "Get up, kid." Jimmy stood up, but his legs were exhausted, no longer under full control. He almost lost his balance. Griffin grabbed Donnie's arm and yanked him away from Jimmy, throwing the child out from under the stands. "All of you, up!" Tay, Edith, and Billy got to their feet, huddled together, crying, sobbing. Jimmy felt powerless. He knew he should be doing something. He had to do something. But he was just a kid and he didn't know what. Move! Jimmy felt Griffin's hand on his back as he was shoved forward. The 4 children stumbled after him until they were in the arena, by the bodies, encircled by the smoking ruins of wooden seats lit by laser fire days ago. Jimmy gathered the children close to him, trying to shield them as long as he could. Griffin held his rifle on them, thumbed to communicator. "This is Griff. I got that last pack of kids by the depot. Names?" It was just one word over comlink, but Jimmy recognized the governor's voice. "It's Kirk, like we thought. Hebert, Zaglata, Clued." Griffin glared at Jimmy, pointed his rifle at Donnie. "Who's the brat?" Jimmy didn't recognize his own voice as he answered reflexively. "Donnie? Donnie Roy?" "Roy," Griffin repeated. "The records have been updated," the governor replied. "Have Matthew take care of this." "Done." Griffin thumbed the communicator shut, glanced away from his captors for a moment. "Matty, time to earn your rations." Matthew came out from the darkness then, his face blank and unreadable, so different from 4 days ago. Jimmy didn't want to know what his best friend had seen in the last 4 days, how many more he had killed. Matthew didn't look at him or any of the kids. "Griff, Jimmy's my friend." Griffin placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done this before. You're on the list. They're not. You know what that means." "Yeah, but maybe I don't want to do this anymore." Griffin grasped Matthew's jaw hard, forced him to look up at him. "The governor saved your life. He offered to save Jimmy's too. You can't get much fairer than that." Jimmy saw the cold, hard look in Griffin's eyes. It said if Matthew didn't kill the children, then Griffin was going to kill Matthew. "You want to make the governor proud? Let him know he made the right choice?" Matthew nodded. Griffin released his grip on Matthew. "Then do Jimmy first. It'll be easier." Jimmy watched, incredulous, as Matthew raised his laser rifle, activated it, then awkwardly swung the heavy weapon around to him. "Remember, you're on the list," Griffin said. "He's not." Matthew took aim. Jimmy saw his friend's lip tremble. Jimmy was frozen in place, unable to think, unable to move, unable to breathe. But then Edith screamed and ran, and before Jimmy could do anything, Matthew jerked around and fired, and a red lance of light punched through Edith's torso in 2 puffs of vaporized blood front and back, instantly silencing her as her body went limp, and she fell face down on the other bodies, arms and legs waving like blowing grain. As her flimsy shirt burned, small flames flickered around the blackened hole in her spine. In shocked silence, Jimmy heard only the sizzle, smelled only sharp ting of ionized air. Then the frightened cries reached him, whatever. Donnie was curled up on the ground. Billy and Tig clutched each other, weeping. "Good shot," Griffin said to Matthew. "Shut the rest up and we're done." This time, when Matthew turned his rifle on Jimmy, his lip didn't tremble, and there was nothing awkward in the way he raised the weapon. He said, "Fair's fair, Jimmy. You had your chance." Even before Matthew fired the laser, Jimmy felt himself die. Then the wall behind Griffin and Matthew exploded into light, and Jimmy felt himself lifted through the air in a silent blast of heat. For a moment, he was glad that being killed by a laser wasn't painful. Then he landed on the hard, broken flooring and felt enough pain to wake him to the reality of the situation. Soldiers. They wore helmets and goggles and sleek uniforms that swam with ever-changing patterns of adaptive camouflage. Fire pulsed from their weapons, not ordinary lasers, Jimmy recognized, but blasts of phased energy that stunned, not killed. He knew then they weren't soldiers. Starfleet had arrived 4 days too late. He didn't hear the shouts of the security forces or the hum of their phased weapons. The roar of the antimatter charge that had blown open the arena was still hissed in his ears. He didn't see what happened to Matthew or Griffin. He got to his feet while the battle raged. careless of the possibility of being shot. His fear of death had been lost in the moment Matthew aimed his weapon, finger pressing on the stud. Now he felt only rage. At some point, the firefight ended, and a Starfleet security officer found him. A large man twisted something the size of a communicator in his gloved hand, and a thick, warm blanket unfurled. He peeled back a tab on a silver packet, and Jimmy smelled the first hot food, the first real food he had seen for more than a month. The officer spoke to him, but Jimmy still could not hear, nor did he want to. The officer put his hand on Jimmy's shoulder, just like his father had done, just like Griffin had put his hand on Matthew's shoulder, the hand that said everything was going to be all right. Jimmy struck that hand away with all his strength. The officer stepped back, startled. "Where were you?" Jimmy cried, and as if a dam had burst, the tears came along with every emotion, every chord of fear, every pang of loss he had not permitted himself to feel for the past 4 days. "Hey, kid, it's okay, we're here now." "No!" Jimmy pummeled the officer and didn't care that the combat armor protectively hardened at the impact of his fist. "You were supposed to save us. You were supposed to be here when we needed you." Kid. The officer tried to ward off his attack. Jimmy lost the power of words. Only a hoarse cry of despairing fury escaped him. Something so powerful, so basic, born so deep in his unformed mind that speech was impossible. The officer reached out to Jimmy, screamed and punched and kicked, and saw again the blood vaporize from Edith's back, and Donnie curled up on the ground, and Tay and Billy weeping, and he knew this was all someone's fault. It had to be. Jimmy's fingers felt a patch on the officer's shoulder, tore it free from its adaptive camouflage connector so that it resolved in color in his hand. Ad astra per aspera, the patch read, words Jimmy knew by heart, cradling a golden arrowhead rushing against the stars. He crushed the patch in his fist and stumbled back, tormented. The officer held out his hand to the boy. "Kid, let me help." Jimmy threw the crumpled emblem of Starfleet on the smoldering ruins and ran, escaping into the gray storm and chilling wind that flashed snow past him like stars at warp. But inside, he was burning with shame, with fear, and with hatred, for the only answer he could grasp at to explain the horror he had seen. Starfleet had failed here. Starfleet had failed him and Edith and everyone. Jimmy ran and ran and ran and ran. And 3 years later, he was still running. Kirk stood in the middle of the cargo bay, held in place by 2 laser rifles jammed under his chin. The third teenager, untied, bore him. "I should have done this the first time you came to the docks," Matthew said. "You'd better listen to me," Kirk said. Matthew looked at his fellow teenage soldier, and both of them gaped in mock surprise. "We're in a decaying orbit. The Enterprise can get us out of it, but your ship's blocking the impulse port. We have to move it." "I think you're absolutely right, Jimmy. Since our transporter's shot, you should use your communicator to have that Vulcan beam us back to the Enterprise to get her dilithium. Glad to see you're thinking." "We have 20 minutes, Kirk said. "Then we die." Matthew spun his rifle around and drove the butt into Kirk's stomach, making him double over, gasping for air. "Maybe you die," Matthew said. "Maybe other people die. But me, I live forever." He reached to Kirk's equipment belt, tore off the communicator, pushed it into Kirk's face. "Call the Vulcan." "No," Kirk said. Matthew nodded to his soldier, and the teenager dug the muzzle of his rifle into Kirk's side where the flash driver had sliced into him, viciously. Kirk winced, but pushed the rifle aside, stared defiantly at Matthew. "You want to die?" Matthew asked. "That's not much of a threat," Kirk said. "In 20 minutes, we're all going to die, even you." Matthew nodded at his soldier again, and as the laser barrel pushed in, Kirk swept his hand down to deflect it, then spun around to clip the teenager on the side of his head with his fist. In the 2 seconds it took for Matthew to swing his own rifle up to cover Kirk, Kirk had the second soldier's rifle aimed at Matthew. "I can save us all," Kirk said. "Too bad you're outnumbered." Matthew jerked his head to the side. From the corner of his eye, Kirk saw the third teenager rifle raised and aimed. Borum was beside him, clapping his hands with excitement. Kirk began to lower his rifle. "Guess you got me." "Some things never change, Jimmy. You're still a loser." Kirk shrugged, then swung up his rifle in a blur and fired at the third teenager's weapon to make it explode. Then Matthew fired before Kirk could turn, the laser beam slicing into Kirk's rifle, making the power cell erupt in flames. But before Matthew could fire again, Kirk threw his blazing rifle at him, making him duck. Kirk seized the opportunity to slam into him and drive him to the deck. Matthew fought for his life because that's all he had been trained to do. But Kirk was fighting for Spock and Z and Naderi and Del Mar and unconscious Finnegan and the USS Enterprise and every one of the kids that he'd lost on Tarsus 4. It wasn't even close. The 2 wounded teenagers and the boy stared nervously at him as he stood over his fallen enemy. Kirk knew it would take just one more blow to crush Matthew's neck and put paid to the horror of what happened 3 years ago. "Do it," Matthew croaked. His eyes were swollen, but Kirk knew he could see. Kirk shook his head. "I killed your brother." Kirk reached down, grabbed Matthew by the collar, pushed him close to his face. "That's right," Matthew spat past broken teeth. "In his apartment. He cried and begged for you to save him, and you weren't there." "Liar," Kirk said. "He'd have begged for our dad. He's the one who taught me how to fight." He let Matthew fall back to the floor. He turned to the 2 teenagers and the boy. They flinched away from him. Kirk took a step forward. "I won't hurt you. I only want to—" 3 laser beams sliced the air beside Kirk and killed the 3 children. Kirk wheeled around to see a man standing over Matthew, aiming a laser pistol at his head. He fired once, and Matthew died too. The man looked up at Kirk. "Jimmy," Griffin said, "it's about time." The bridge of the Enterprise was a study in controlled chaos. Z had found a critical equipment locker that held actual pointed operations manuals, presumably to be used at times like these when the computer systems were down. Naderi was paging through one on anti-gravity systems, trying to see if there was some way to shake loose Griffin's ship by reversing gravitational polarity. Z was trying to find the sections that described emergency communications. She was convinced there had to be a battery-powered backup system on the bridge, even if it just used ordinary radio waves. Del Mar was doing calculations to determine how much thrust she could get out of the ship's reaction control thrusters. If they were all fired at once along the same velocity vector, she was certain she could buy them at least another orbit. Finnegan was wrapped in a blanket with a first aid pack serving as a pillow. Del Mar had told the others he was in some kind of coma, and when they had time, there was probably something in sickbay that could repair the damage, provided it came with instructions. But of the skeleton crew that was conscious and capable of doing something, no matter how desperate, only Spock remained still, sitting in the chair at the science station, staring with rapt attention at the flickering blue and black that marked each revolution of the locked-together dying ships. "Is there a reason you're not doing anything?" Z finally asked, her voice thin with frustration. "I am doing something," Spock said pleasantly. "I'm trying to determine the logic behind Griffin's decision to come to Neptune." All 3 mids looked at him in shock. "And that is going to help us figure a way out of this situation how?" Z asked. "I believe that is the point," Spock said. "We do not have to figure a way out." Now they all stared at him in confusion. "There's only one reason for Griffin to have come here, and that means the way out will present itself shortly." The mids exchanged looks, then returned to their manuals. Their search became a touch more frantic. When Griffin shoved Kirk onto the flight deck of the Random Wave, only one young woman was at the helm. Kirk was puzzled that none of the other flight stations was staffed. "I'm Dalla," the woman said. Griffin handed her his laser pistol, and she smiled sweetly as she kept it aimed at Kirk. "Where are all your other kids?" Kirk asked. "I saw at least 10 more in the freighter." Griffin shrugged. "When their jobs were over, I took them off the list." Kirk felt himself turn to stone, but not from fear. "You're still working for Kodos." Griffin sat down at the communications console, glanced back at him. "The governor died on T4. Didn't you hear? They found his body." "A body," Kirk said. "Too badly burned to be positively identified." Dalla shivered. "Ick." Griffin worked some communications controls. "Kodos tried to be a hero, saved the colony. If you're still looking for him, I suggest you try Starfleet. They're all heroes, right?" Kirk studied the spinning stars on the view screen. The angle it showed didn't include Neptune. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before our ships start to burn up." "I don't think so," Griffin said. Whatever he'd been doing at the console, he was finished. A blue light flashed there. A signal, Kirk thought. And then he realized why Griffin wasn't worried about being destroyed in a handful of minutes. "You're expecting company." "Always knew you were a smart one, Jimmy." Griffin got up, took the laser pistol from Dalla. "That's why I'm offering you a job, whether you want it or not." "A rendezvous?" Z asked. "It is the only logical explanation," Spock said. "Griffin is expecting to offload his stolen cargo. He'll need a vessel more suitable for traversing a high-velocity smuggling route out of Federation space." "I might have to argue with you about that," Delmar said from the navigation console. "Indeed," Spock replied. "You do not believe Griffin expects to rendezvous with another vessel? How about 3 other vessels?" Spock turned to the science displays, activated his scanning circuit, and saw what Delmar referred to. 3 new ships were rising out of Neptune's depths, and even with the crude resolution of the science scanner, Spock knew what kind of ships they were. As they slipped through the last layers of Neptune's frigid atmosphere, the 3 ships could be glimpsed by the flickering light from the incandescent streamers of plasma shed by their shields. They were all of the same class, compact, shaped like closed mollusk shells, all propulsion units and sensor pods, and weapons arrays, curved and blended into the arcs of their single hulls, with the forward bridge resembling a warrior's helmet. The silhouette of these ships was known to every Starfleet crew, especially to those who had last served on the Enterprise and successfully repulsed a boarding effort by the aliens who flew them. Their hulls were green, so all would know their masters. Deep within the heart of the Federation, deep within the peaceful home system that had given birth to Starfleet, 3 Orion Corsairs rose to do battle. "Pirates," Spock said. Of the 3 mids on the bridge, Nanderi was the most perplexed. How did Orion Corsairs get this close to Earth? How did they even get past the frontier? "Excellent questions," Spock observed. Praise didn't help Nanderi. "How about some excellent answers?" "I have none," Spock admitted. Delmar sighed. "Well, then it gives us something to look forward to when you do have some." Spock gave Delmar a curious look, but she was already flipping hurriedly through a weapons manual. We've got no torpedoes. We have no idea how to recharge those new phaser banks. We can't raise shields, and we can't call for reinforcements. So here's my excellent question. How do we blast those nasty green clamshells out of space?" "Even if we knew how," Spock cautioned, "it would not be prudent." Delmar put her hands on her hips. "Keep going, Mr. Spock. By now, we've all sort of figured out that if we just stare at you long enough, you'll eventually get around to explaining whatever it is you're talking about." As Spock replied, it was almost as if he had to struggle to keep the barest flicker of a smile from appearing on his lips. "Midshipman Delmar, those nasty green clamshells are what will save us." Delmar grinned but didn't give way. "You can't stop there." Kirk lurched back as the Orion's tractor beams engaged a random wave and the small ship's flight deck tilted. He saw Dalla stumble too and quickly checked out Griffin. But Griffin had anticipated the contact and had braced himself. His weapon was still pointing directly at Kirk. "Don't even think about it," he warned. "Think about what?" Griffin wasn't so easily distracted. "Seriously, don't spoil a good thing. My friends out there will stabilize our orbit long enough to beam over the cargo, then we go too." "You can't make me do anything," Kirk said. "Kid, I remember you back on T4. Before the fungus hit, you rode my horse." Kirk nodded. That was one memory of Tarsus 4 he didn't have to block out. "You didn't know what you were doing," Griffin said, "but you wouldn't let anyone tell you what to do either. Stubbornest kid I ever saw. That's what I told Kodos. That's why he chose you." Kirk held onto the side of the empty command chair as the flight deck creaked. "Why did Kodos choose you? Simple. I wanted to live. Everyone wanted to live. Not everyone could. We had months of food in the storehouses, and the next cargo fleet wasn't due for a year." "A year's a long time. A lot of things could have happened." Anger flashed in Griffin's eyes. "What does it matter, kid? It's over and done with." And with those words, as simply as that, Kirk understood what he never had. Once again, he heard Mallory's voice from that first night they met. "Patterns," he had said. "You've heard that old saying, those who don't remember the past are doomed to repeat it?" Kirk had, but had never comprehended what it really meant. For 7,000 years or so, humans appear to have lived in a permanent state of forgetfulness. Not one generation free of war or famine or injustice, and then we woke up. It took the worst war we'd ever experienced, but out of all that came Cochrane, and a new generation, for the first time, wouldn't forget. Because the pattern was broken, so no more wars, no more need, no more injustice. The world, our world, is the way it is today because we remember the patterns of history, and we do not repeat them. "We woke up," Kirk said quietly. "What?" Griffin asked. "The pattern was broken," Kirk said, his voice gaining strength. "What pattern? What are you talking about?" Kirk looked into the face of the beast from his past and knew why Kodos had chosen Griffin, knew why Tarsus 4 was over for him. The children who had fought for Kodos, committed atrocities, killed their own friends and families, they didn't know what they were doing. They were innocent, unformed, and trusting. But the puppet masters, Kodos and Griffin, and eventually Matthew, all those who should have known better, who should have known the patterns of the past, and should have woken up, should have refused to repeat those patterns, they were already dead, if not in body, then in spirit. For 3 years, Kirk had tried to forget the nightmare world he had seen and been part of, and that's what had trapped him in the past. But if he remembered the pattern of what had gone so horribly wrong, he would not repeat it. He could break it. That knowledge freed him like nothing he had ever experienced before, and in the midst of that release, he remembered something else that Mallory had told him, something else important that he had not understood until this moment. If we remember the patterns of history, we do not repeat them. Griffin stared at him. "What do you mean by we?" "Starfleet," Kirk said. "The Orions are beaming cargo from Griffin's ship." Z looked up from the auxiliary tactical station where she had managed to bring more sensors online. "At the rate they're going, I'd say they'll be finished in 5, maybe 6 minutes. "Then they're going to drop us again, aren't they?" Delmar said. "Push us back into the atmosphere to burn us up along with the evidence." Naderi suddenly jumped up from his chair at the helm. "Shuttlecraft! There should be at least 2 down on the hangar deck." "There will be," Spock said, "once the hangar deck refit has been completed." Naderi frowned. "No shuttlecraft?" Spock shook his head. "A worthy suggestion, however." Naderi jumped up again. Saucer separation. We would need the impulse ports to be clear. Naderi sat down again, dejected. I know. Another worthy suggestion. Come on, people, Delmar said. We've got most of a starship here. There's got to be something it can do to take out those pirates, or at least slow them down. Slow them down, Spock said, deep in thought. Delmar ran up to him, motioning with her hands as if to coax a few more words out of him. I like the way you said that. Keep going. Spock stood. Our transporters work. As they beam the cargo over to their ships, we will beam it back to ours. Delmar leaned in, paused, asked, That's a fake uniform, right? You're not really a mid? Spock shook his head. Good. Then the fraternization rules don't apply. With that, Delmar hugged him. Then she said to the others, Naderi, stay at the helm. Z, keep trying to restore communications. She patted Spock on the shoulder, and he was proud that he controlled himself and did not flinch. The great imposter and I will be in the transport room, making life miserable for our friends out there. Delmar grabbed Spock by the arm and dragged him to the turbo lift. Let's go, handsome, you're on. Spock wasn't quite certain what had just happened, but it was fascinating nonetheless. Griffin spun around in his chair and punched a comm switch. What do you mean they're stealing our cargo? The reply was in the Orion trader's tongue. Kirk couldn't understand it, but he recognized the cadence because it was so often used in hollow entertainments featuring Orion villains and, inevitably, Orion dancing girls, inevitably. Then raise your shields, Griffin shouted. Kirk thought he knew what was going on. It sounded as if the people on the Enterprise were doing what the Orions were doing, beaming cargo off Griffin's ship. An irate Orion tirade came over the comlink. Whatever was said, Griffin had had enough. Forget the cargo, then. Lock on any life signs you can find and beam the crew over. Beam them into space for all I care. Just stop their interference. Griffin's frustration was the equal of the unintelligible Orions at the other end of the comlink. He angrily flicked a switch on and off several times, which Kirk knew would cause an annoying screech for the receiver. Acknowledge, will you? Griffin demanded, and by doing so left himself wide open. As Kirk leapt into action, he had the thought that there was at least some justice playing out today. Griffin was so preoccupied by the threat outside his ship he'd forgotten the threat inside. Kirk's first punch from behind caught Griffin on the side of his head. Griffin twisted with a savage shout, and Kirk easily caught his hand to block him from aiming his laser pistol. Griffin fired anyway, and the crimson beam slashed across the overhead, exploding lights and scorching the bulkhead in a sizzling arc until Kirk slammed Griffin's hand down so hard on the console that the pistol dropped to the floor. By now, Griffin had turned completely in his chair, and he jumped up, trying to butt his head into Kirk's face. But Kirk sidestepped and threw Griffin over his shoulder, then leapt on top of him, wrapped his arms around his neck, and began to put pressure on the carotid artery to drive him into unconsciousness. I think you'd better stop now, Dalla said. Kirk looked up even as Griffin struggled beneath him, clawing at his arms. Dalla was aiming the dropped laser pistol at Kirk. Right now, she said. He killed Matthew, Kirk told her. I never liked him, Dalla said. And his crew of kids. That boy bore him. All damaged goods. The general saw to that. Kirk didn't know who the general was, had no time to ask. You won't shoot me. Yes, I will. No, you won't. Because only I've taken care of Griffin. You and I are in charge of this ship. We can go anywhere, do anything. Kirk felt Griffin go limp. He had kept Dalla talking long enough for the chokehold to work. He stood up, but Dalla didn't change her aim. She licked the corner of her lip. Aren't you kind of young? Kirk tried to look at her, as if they were already alone in a honeymoon suite on Risa. He'd heard the stories. Some women would think that's an advantage. Dalla pointed the gun away. Just get me out of this system. I'll do more than that, Kirk promised with what he hoped was a seductive leer. Then he swept her up in his arms and in the same movement slapped the laser pistol from her hand. spun her around, in less than 10 seconds had her hands tied with her own equipment belt. He pushed her down into the command chair, told her not to move, scooped up the laser pistol just to be sure, and rushed to the helm to raise shields and block the Orion's transporter before his fellow crewmates could be captured or killed. Fellow crewmates, Kirk thought. That didn't sound so bad. In the Enterprise's one working transporter room, a feedback alarm chimed. Okay, now what? Delmar asked Spock. She was up on the platform, soaked in sweat from throwing crates and other transported cargo to the floor as quickly as Spock could beam it in. At the console, Spock checked the readings. Griffin's ship has raised shields to maximum, which means they encompass the Enterprise as well. Delmar jumped down to join Spock. So we can't transport anything, but neither can the Orions. That's great news, right? Apparently, the Orions do not share your opinion. They are powering up their weapons. Z and Naderi sat at the con, staring at the tactical status display that showed the Orion's locking weapons. Are the shields from Griffin's ship going to help us? Z asked. They won't last more than a couple of salvos, Naderi answered. He brought up more tactical displays. We've got to have something we can fight back with. There's... Whoa! Well, what? The phaser banks have recharged. By themselves? Must be an automated system. We've got at least 2 more shots. Better make them count. Naderi frowned at Z. You think? Kirk saw the flight deck's tactical display light up. It was never intended for battle, but he could see the Orions were locking weapons. Over the comm link, a deep Orion voice spoke in short, clipped words with a regular pause between each one. Is that a countdown? Kirk asked Dalla. I don't know, Dalla said petulantly. I don't speak green. Kirk put all the power the ship could generate into its shields. As the lights dimmed on the flight deck, he told himself it was the best he could do. But as always, he wished he could do more. Spock and Delmar charged out of the turbolift onto the bridge. Z turned to them while Naderi remained hunched over his console. We've got phasers, she said. 2 shots at least. And I am going to make them count. Naderi held his finger over the weapons control. On the screen, Spock saw that the 3 Orion Corsairs had aligned themselves so all their weapons pods pointed in the same direction, directly at the Enterprise. 3, Naderi said. 2. The weapons pod on the center Corsair suddenly flared in a silent explosion. Arcs of energy leapfrogged over its hull, sending geysers of venting gas into space at each contact point. Then the starboard Corsair lost a propulsion nacelle to an even larger explosion. It spun, spewing vapor and sparks, to collide with the middle Corsair, just as both weapons pods on the port Corsair blew up in a spectacular double explosion. Fantastic shooting, Z said. You're an ace, Delmar exclaimed. But Naderi turned slowly from the helm, still holding up his finger. It wasn't me. Ah, of course, Spock said. It is the only logical explanation. The 3 mids turned to him, Delmar with her hands on her hips, and they waited.